Hello, this is Peter Adams at the Community College of Baltimore County, and this is one of a series of videos that we've prepared to help faculty members both at our school and across the country who are teaching in the Accelerated Learning Program at their school. We hope to raise questions about what works in an ALP classroom, suggest some answers and solutions for those questions, and provide some sample materials that you might find useful in your own teaching. This first video is addressing the issue of how to help students be more thoughtful about their writing, to get them used to the idea that most of the time, good, strong, effective writing is based on good, strong, effective thinking. So I want to start this video with a little story from my high school experiences a few years ago, actually about 50 years ago, when I took a course in American history in my senior year, and the first half of the course, the first semester, covered the Civil War. And at the end of that semester, we had a take-home exam in which we were asked to write an essay of 500 words or more, in which we explained the causes of the Civil War. Now, I had paid attention in class, listened to my teacher talk about the Civil War. I had read the history textbook about the Civil War, and I was fairly certain of the three major causes that both the text and the history teacher had said were the causes of the Civil War. One was disagreements over abolition and slavery. Second was states' rights versus federalism. And the third was the economic and social differences between the South and the North in America. However, I also remembered an experience that I had had a number of years earlier in visits down to the South, where I had a number of cousins, mostly in the state of Georgia. And they told me that the primary reason that the South went to war with the North during the Civil War was because the Southerners had read too many novels by Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott, I asked, and they reminded me that Sir Walter Scott was a 19th century novelist, very prolific, who wrote a series of novels all similar to his most successful novel, Ivanhoe. The theme of all these novels was very similar, and that is that tyrannical, powerful, rich, industrial, military England was dominating poor, small, rural, and relatively unarmed Scotland, and that the Scottish nobles had to fight, if necessary, had to sacrifice their lives to defend noble little Scotland against this huge industrial military power to the south. And the problem for the South in America was that they identified with Scotland and began to see their noble duty as standing up to the North, including sacrificing their lives if necessary. And so in the essay I wrote for the take-home final for my history class, I said that there were four causes of the Civil War: slavery, the argument between states' rights and federalism, economic and social differences between the North and South, and the fact that the South read too much of the novels of Sir Walter Scott. Thinking that not only had I answered the question correctly, but I'd also done some creative thinking of my own about the causes of the Civil War, and that I probably would have knocked the socks off my history teacher. And so I was, shall we say, startled a week later when I got my midterm exam back from my teacher with a big F on the top of it. And he kept me after class and said, "What were you thinking of? I can't believe that you think that Sir Walter Scott had anything to do with the Civil War. Didn't you listen when I explained in class? Didn't you listen when I gave a review session for the midterm exam, for the final exam? Didn't you read your textbook?" And so what I learned from this was nothing about the Civil War, but I learned a lesson about writing. And it was that when teachers, at least my history teacher, and I generalized from that to teachers in general, that when teachers ask you to write an essay, what they're really looking for is whether you can give them back whatever they lectured you about in class, whether you can regurgitate what the textbook said. And what they are not looking for is what I thought was terribly clever, creative thinking. And my fear is that that's a lesson our students have learned all too well. And what I'm going to argue in this video is that one of our jobs as writing teachers is to teach our students that this is not always true, that there certainly are teachers who ask their students to write essays with no other goal than proving they read the book or proving that they paid attention in class. And that's undeniably true. But there are plenty of cases where teachers really do want you to do some problem solving, some creative thinking when you write a paper. And certainly in life that's the case. That it is usually not satisfactory in the business world to write a paper that regurgitates what everybody already knows. When you're asked to write a report on a problem, they expect you to think creatively and come up with a solution of the problem. So my argument here is that we need to communicate that message to our students. One time, a few years ago, I had a student named Susan, and I was working with her in the Writing Center, and I asked her, Susan, how do you go, just describe the process you go through when you write a paper for me. And she said, well, to start with, I have to come up with a thesis. And once I do that, then I have to think of some reasons why that thesis is true. And when I've got 3 reasons, then I'm ready to write my conclusion. And the conclusion just restates the thesis in different words. And this is something, Susan is not the only student who's told me that's how she goes about writing an essay. And one of the things I asked Susan that day was, well, I'd like to talk about the first step in that process. You told me the first step is you come up with a thesis. And I'm wondering, how do you do that? How do you come up with a thesis? And she said quickly and brightly, oh, it's easy. You give us a question or a topic to write about. And my thesis is whatever I think about that question, whatever I think about that topic. And what I want to argue in this video is that there are at least 2 different meanings for the word think. There's the one that Susan is using, and then there's the meaning of the word think that I want to use and that I would like Susan and all my other students to start using. And the difference is this. The way Susan is using the word think is the equivalent of when someone comes to you and says, what do you think of this new tie I bought? Or when the Gallup poll rings your phone at home and asks you, what do you think about global warming? Or what do you think about Hillary Clinton? And what they want to know is your gut response, right off the top of your head. What do you think when I ask you this question, when I give you this topic? When we give our students questions or topics to write about, that's not what I am arguing, that is not what we mean by the word think. To illustrate what we mean, let me talk about another student I had a couple of years ago. Greg wrote a paper in which his thesis was that Maryland needs tougher laws against drunk driving. And he gave 3 examples. The first one involved his sister being hit by a drunk driver, and the driver was convicted of driving under the influence, but was given probation before judgment. And then there was a boy in my high school class, he said, who was found guilty of driving while intoxicated. And this is his second offense, but the judge gave him a sentence of only 6 months and then suspended the sentence. And his third example was a little girl in his neighborhood who was killed by a drunk driver, and the judge sentenced that driver to, quote, time served. And he then wrote his thesis for the paper, which was, in conclusion, judges in Maryland need to start giving tougher sentences for drunk driving. At first glance, this looks just like the paper that Susan was discussing. But let's look again. Let me get rid of the reasons in between and just look at the thesis, Maryland needs tougher laws against drunk driving, and the conclusion, judges need to start giving tougher sentences. Notice that those are not the same thing. That Greg's thesis, when he gets to the end of the paper, has actually changed from what it was at the beginning of the paper. And why did that happen? Aha! Aha, Peter says. This is the key moment in this videotape. The thesis changed because Greg did some thinking. In other words, as he came up with those examples in between and thought about each example as he put it in there, in no case did the example show that we needed tougher laws. What the example showed is the judges weren't enforcing the laws we have, that the judges were being too lenient with people driving while intoxicated. And so I want to argue that it's that kind of thinking, the thinking that went on between the start of this paper and the end of this paper, that our students need to do to arrive at a thesis. Now, if this, of course, were an essay that you were about to turn in, you would need to fix it. That is, you can't have an essay whose thesis is something different at the end than it was in the beginning. We know about problems with unity. But I use this not for that purpose, but I use this example to point out that when you think about a topic, you often come to, if you really do put your mind to work on it, you often do change the way, change your opinion, change your thoughts, change your conclusion. And so the idea that you start with a thesis and then all you got to do is find some examples that will support that thesis, it seems to me is a mistake that most students have, a mistaken idea about how to go about writing an essay. Now, one of the ways they can go about it is the way Greg did, by writing the whole essay and then saying, now what do I think at the end, and changing the paper, revising the paper based on the thought process that went into writing the first draft. Another thing that we can encourage students to do is to brainstorm, to come up with examples, not to start writing the paper, but to just brainstorm for ideas about a particular question or a particular topic, and sort of withhold judgment on what the thesis is until they come to the end of that brainstorming process. And finally, on papers that are serious research papers involving lots of trips to the library and to the internet, lots of times students say their process is they first come up with a thesis and then start doing research to support that thesis. And I would like to argue that the process should be just the reverse. Do some research so that you get seeing what other people have said, and then that jogs your mind into thinking about the various issues involved in your topic, and arrive at the thesis after some serious research has been done, not before. So that's the sort of principle I'm arguing for in this video. I have another exercise that I do in class that is designed at getting at this same idea. In fact, it's sort of an exercise in which I ask students to try to figure out what makes writing interesting. And in many cases, what they find is how hard the writer has been thinking makes the biggest difference in how interesting the writing is. So here's the assignment. I asked my students early in the semester, sometimes the first day of class, certainly during the first week, to write me an essay. Sometimes I actually do it in class and have it just be a one-pager, but in this case, the assignment was for 3 pages, in which you tell me one interesting thing about the kind of person you are. And so my students write those papers, they turn them in, I read them over, and I make just a list of the theses of all these papers. And I put them on a handout, and I give that handout back to my students. And here's some of the theses they came up with. One thing that best describes me is I'm very outgoing. I'm thoughtful. I like to consider myself somewhat outgoing. I've always been a determined person. I like to meet new people, make new friends. I'm very outgoing. Most of the time I'm angry. I want to do well in school. My desire to help other people is selfish at heart. There are many characteristics that I have. The one that sticks out the most would be that I am giving. I'm a very outgoing person because I'm afraid to be alone. The type of person that I happen to be is a good person. One trait about me that sticks out and can easily be connected to me is how creative I am. I'm a very adventurous person. The majority of people I asked said I'm caring. I'm a generous person, but I'm not a fool. I'm something of a chameleon. I feel an important thing to know about myself is that I am ambitious. I have been described as many things, adventurous being one of them. I am a very generous person. So there were 20 theses that my students turned in in one class for this assignment. And I give this handout just about the way it looks here. Actually, I write them in one column, not 2. And ask them to read them over, get them into little groups of 4 or 5, and ask each group to identify the 5 theses out of these 20 that sound like they're going to produce the most interesting writing, the theses that they would most be interested in reading papers about. And when I first started doing this exercise, at this point I would hold my breath because I asked the groups to put their lists on the board. And what I find is remarkable agreement, remarkable unanimity from the 3 or 4 or 5 groups I get out of a class of 20. Excuse me. And they agree that something like these 5 are the most interesting theses. And occasionally there will be a group that'll pick one other one that's not in red on the screen, but hardly ever and never more than one is there disagreement about. And so what the really useful part of this exercise is to ask the groups then to study the 5 theses that they identified, numbers 7, 9, 11, 16, and 17, as most interesting, and explain why those 5 got almost all the votes. And I give them a little time to do this, and it's really interesting. They're very good at doing this. They point out, for example, that number 9 is very interesting because there are a lot of them that say, I'm a very giving person, I'm a very generous person, I like to help other people. But number 9 has thought a little harder about it, and therefore it sounds like it's going to be more interesting to read. My desire to help other people is really selfish at heart. Or number 16 has a similar interesting twist to it. I am a generous person. There 6 or 8 people said they were that. I'm a generous person, but I'm not a fool. And that person recognizes that generosity is a little more complicated than just being a very giving person to everybody in the world, that there's such a thing as too much generosity. And in number 11 also has an interesting twist. A lot of the other theses said, I'm a very outgoing person, I like to meet new people and so forth. This person says, I'm a very outgoing person because I'm afraid to be alone. So I think those 3 that everyone voted for are really dramatic demonstrations of how those 3 writers actually thought a little harder and came up with something more insightful, more creative, more perceptive, more interesting about the thesis that they were going to write about. And then the other 2 are just interesting because they're not predictable. These people thought of something about themselves that was a little more unique, a little more individual, and all of the other ones, all the theses written in black on this handout, it seems to me, are very predictable. There's at least 2 or 3 similar ones for each of the topics that it's as if everybody wanted to tell me what a good Boy Scout or Girl Scout they are, that they're brave, clean, and reverent, and so forth. But number 7 wasn't interested in sounding like a Boy Scout. She or he told me that most of the time I'm angry. And number 17 came up with a really interesting metaphor. I am something of a chameleon. So in each case, the theses that all of my students, remember, what they're seeing here is their judgment, not an English teacher's judgment, but their judgment about which were the most interesting theses. And I think it's a dramatic way of demonstrating to students that that a little bit of thought before you start writing and while you're writing will really produce much better writing. Now, I want to take a quick look at a different set. The ones that are in red on the screen now are different. Notice number 1 says, one thing that best describes me. Number 10 says, the one thing that sticks out about me most. Number 13 says, one trait about me that sticks out and can easily be connected to me. 15 says, the majority of people responding to my poll said I'm caring. And 18 says, it's an important thing to know about me. Those people didn't answer the question that I had asked in the prompt for this assignment, which just was, tell me one interesting thing about yourself. What they answered was a different question. Tell me the one thing about you that most people would say is a prominent characteristic, a major trait of yours. And I didn't ask them to do that. And this almost always happens when I do this exercise. And I, being as predictable as my students, almost always follow this up with the following little exercise. This is called the 9 dots puzzle, and I put it on the board. I put it on a overhead. I give it to them as a handout. It depends on what kind of a classroom I'm teaching in. But the puzzle is this: there are 9 dots, and then there's a set of rules for the puzzle. And the rules are very, very explicit. You may use up to 4 lines, no more. All the lines must be straight, no curvy lines. You cannot lift your pen or pencil from the paper when you're drawing the lines, and you cannot retrace a line. And so I give them that puzzle, and I give them a few minutes to work on solving the puzzle. Most of the time, nobody gets it. If somebody, every once in a while, there'll be a student or 2 who's seen this puzzle before, and even so, they usually can't remember what the solution is. So what they'll do is something like this: 3 lines, a 4th line, and I always sort of mockingly say, pretty good job there. You got 8 out of the 9. But of course you have to connect all 9 dots. And what is the solution to the puzzle? They left out this one. What is the solution to the puzzle? Here you go. You draw a line over like this, and then down like this, and then up like this, and then down like this. 4 straight lines without lifting my electronic pencil from the paper, connecting all 9 dots. At about that time, one of my students says, and if they don't, I ask them, well, how come no one came up with that? And one of my students will almost always say, usually several of them, you didn't tell us we could go outside the 9 dots. And of course, that's where that expression comes from. Thinking outside the box comes from this puzzle. And why didn't they? Of course, I didn't tell them they couldn't go. I didn't tell them that they could go outside the dots. But I did give them, remember, a series of 4 rules. And none of the rules was you have to stay inside the 9 dots. But they imposed that 5th rule on themselves. They decided that it must be the case that they can't go outside the 9 dots. And these students in this that wrote the red sentences here did the same thing. Instead of trying to think of the most interesting thing they could write about themselves, they imposed a different rule on themselves. They said, oh, it has to be a very prominent thing about me. It has to be something everybody would agree is true about me and really sticks out about me, as they put it. And so that's a little thinking exercise about that leads to the common expression, thinking outside the 9 dots. So that's the end of this first video. There is a second video in this series that explores some other techniques for encouraging more thinking on the part of students, and that's called Thinking About It number 2. If you have a chance, I hope you'll be able to watch that one too. Thanks for your attention.